My name is Quinn Lee, and at 38, I've built my life around two things I hold sacred: my work as a pediatric nurse and my little girl, Harper. Being a single mom isn't easy, especially when your own family is tangled in complicated emotions that never seem to heal. Every day, I juggle the relentless demands of my job caring for sick children with the exhausting effort to shield Harper from the undercurrents of tension that ripple through our family. I've been a pediatric nurse for 14 years now. I still remember the first time I held a fragile newborn in my hands, the weight of that tiny life pressing into my soul. It's a role that requires calm under pressure, steady hands, and a heart that aches for every child who suffers. But being a nurse is only half the story. The other half is being Harper's mother, fiercely protective, endlessly patient, and sometimes quietly desperate. Our family dynamic is complex, often fraught with unspoken rules and cold silences. My parents, Samuel and Elaine Lee, carry a commanding presence that fills every room, yet their warmth is sparse, reserved mostly for my older brother, Marcus. I've learned over the years how to navigate their subtle disapproval and veiled criticism, keeping my head down and my hopes quiet. But inside, I'm always hoping for a moment of true connection, a sign that despite everything, family means more than control or disappointment. Today, the tension feels heavier than usual. We're preparing for a family trip to the theme park, a rare occasion meant to be full of laughter and togetherness. But as I watch my parents bustle around the airport, their movements sharp, their words clipped, an uneasy feeling settles in my chest. Harper is clutching her small backpack, her bright eyes wide with a mix of excitement and nervousness. She looks to me for reassurance, and I try to smile, to be the steady anchor she needs. But I can't shake the coldness I see in my parents' expressions whenever they look at Harper. It's the kind of look that says she doesn't quite belong, that she's a source of frustration rather than joy. Elaine's lips press into a thin line when Harper runs ahead to grab a snack, and Samuel's eyes narrow briefly before he turns away. These small moments gnaw at me because I know they're not accidental. They're part of a pattern I've witnessed for years. A quiet but persistent undervaluing of both Harper and me. As we move closer to the boarding gate, I keep Harper close, whispering silly jokes to distract her from the stiff atmosphere. I catch my mother's gaze from across the terminal, cold and unreadable. She meets my eyes for a moment, and I force myself not to look away. Somewhere beneath that hard shell, I want to believe there's still a flicker of kindness, but I'm not sure anymore. Despite the tension, I remind myself this trip is supposed to be a fresh start, a chance for family memories that don't involve confrontation or pain. I hold Harper's hand tightly as the boarding announcement echoes through the loudspeakers, and I'm determined to keep her safe. Because no matter how distant my parents may be, Harper deserves love without conditions. As the crowd begins to move forward, I glance back once more at my parents. They're talking quietly, their faces serious. I catch the edge of a phrase, "She'll learn a lesson," though I'm not sure if I heard it right. My heart skips a beat. I brush it off, telling myself it couldn't be about Harper. But that uneasy feeling deepens. Right now, I'm standing at a crossroads between hope and fear, between the family I want us to be and the reality that keeps pulling us apart. All I want is to protect Harper, to shield her from the fractures beneath our family's surface. As the boarding call intensifies and the crowd surges, I grip Harper's hand even tighter, silently praying that this trip will not only bring joy, but also healing, or at least, that it won't break us further. Growing up in the Lee family was like living in two different worlds, and I always felt like I was stuck on the wrong side of the invisible divide. From the very beginning, my parents' favoritism toward Marcus was as blatant as it was painful. I wasn't imagining it. My father, Samuel, would openly shower Marcus with praise and expectations, comparing me in ways that left no room for my own accomplishments. I remember one particular evening when I was about 10 years old. I brought home a report card filled with A's and a few B's. I was proud. I'd worked hard in school, especially in math, which didn't come easily to me. But when I showed it to my father, he barely glanced at it before turning to Marcus, who was sitting nearby, grinning with the latest trophy from his little league game. Samuel clapped Marcus on the back and said, "That's the kind of effort I want to see. You're the one who's going places." Then, without a word of encouragement for me, he went back to reading the newspaper. The sting of that dismissal was sharp and immediate. It was as if my achievements didn't matter unless they were the ones that fit his ideal: loud, visible, and male. My mother, Elaine, was a different kind of cold. Where my father's favoritism was loud and public, hers was silent, but just as cutting. Over the years, I noticed how she would criticize me for being too sensitive, too soft, especially compared to Marcus, who was always strong and assertive. If I cried at a movie, she'd say, "Stop being such a baby. Toughen up." If I struggled with something, she'd sigh and remind me repeatedly that life wasn't fair, lessons I had to learn early. But these lessons often felt less about preparing me for the world and more about belittling me in front of others. This imbalance wasn't limited to words. Family events were battlegrounds where the lines of favoritism were drawn clearly. Birthdays, holidays, and even casual dinners were often skewed so Marcus could shine. When he succeeded, the house buzzed with celebration and pride. When I succeeded, the responses were muted or overshadowed by his accomplishments. One Christmas, when I received a modest gift of art supplies that I'd begged for, Marcus got a new bike and a video game console. My parents' faces lit up as Marcus tore into his presents, while I felt invisible, holding back tears as I smiled through the sting of insignificance. Even worse were the times I was excluded entirely. I remember a summer when the family went on a week-long trip to the beach without me. I was only 12, but I'd already internalized that I was the spare child, the one who wasn't quite enough to be included in the special family moments. When I asked my mother why I wasn't going, her answer was cold and casual. "You're too much trouble. Marcus needs us more right now." The words echoed in my mind for years afterward, a harsh reminder of where I stood. These patterns didn't just shape my childhood, they became the framework for how the Lee family functioned. My parents rationalized their behavior as discipline or tough love, especially when it came to me. They said I needed to be stronger, to stop expecting special treatment, to learn my place. But what they called tough love was really a roadmap of neglect and favoritism, disguised as family values. Over time, I began to rationalize it all, telling myself that Marcus was their favorite because he needed more guidance, or because he was the firstborn. I convinced myself that Elaine's coldness was just part of her personality, and that Samuel's dismissiveness was because he was stressed with work. I clung to these excuses because the alternative, seeing the harsh reality of my parents' disregard, was too painful. I wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, they loved me as much as they loved Marcus. But deep down, I knew the truth was more complicated. The favoritism wasn't a mistake or misunderstanding. It was a pattern so ingrained that it shaped every interaction. It wasn't just about who got praise or attention. It was about who was allowed to feel worthy and who wasn't. And I was always the one left standing in the shadow, learning early that my achievements were never quite enough to earn my parents' true approval. These early wounds didn't just disappear when I became an adult. They echoed in every family gathering, every conversation, and every glance. Even now, I could see the faint but familiar lines of favoritism around the edges of our family dynamic, threatening to pull Harper into the same painful cycle. Watching my parents' subtle coldness toward her stirred something protective and determined inside me, a resolve to break the pattern before it could take root in my daughter's life. The truth was undeniable. The dynamics that shaped my childhood were still very much alive, and recognizing that was both a painful awakening and a call to action. I've spent much of my adult life trying to prove my worth, not just to my parents, but to myself. It wasn't enough to survive their coldness. I wanted to show that I could carry the weight of our family, that I could be the steady one, the dependable one. So I made sacrifices, big ones, not flashy or dramatic, but the kind that quietly chip away at your sense of self over time. Financially, I became the family's safety net long before Harper was born. When my grandparents' health started failing and Samuel's construction business hit a rough patch, I stepped in without hesitation. I didn't announce it or demand thanks. I just did it because no one else would. I balanced extra shifts at the hospital with managing payments for medical bills, home repairs, and even school fees for Marcus's children. Every overdue notice I wiped away felt like a small victory, but it also reminded me how much I was carrying alone. One winter, when Marcus lost his job unexpectedly, I took on the burden of supporting him too. While he struggled to find his footing, I covered rent and utilities for his small apartment, bought groceries, and even helped with his car payments so he could keep driving to interviews. My own savings dwindled faster than I wanted to admit, but I told myself it was temporary, just a rough patch that would pass. Meanwhile, my parents never asked how Harper or I were doing. Instead, there was an unspoken expectation that I'd manage everything, that I'd be the one to pick up the slack without complaint. When I suggested we pool resources to help with grandparents' care, Elaine brushed me off, saying, "You've always been the responsible one, Quinn. You'll figure it out." It felt less like praise and more like a demand. Caring for my aging grandparents was another layer of responsibility I shouldered mostly alone. I arranged medical appointments, coordinated home care, and even learned how to manage their medications. While Samuel and Elaine visited sporadically, they left the day-to-day details to me. Sometimes I'd catch Marcus's disapproving glance when I mentioned the time I spent driving to the pharmacy or sitting with Grandma during her afternoon naps. I knew he saw it as a burden or a distraction from his own life, not the labor of love it was. I can't count how many nights I stayed up late, balancing nursing textbooks and family budgets, while worrying about Harper's future and my own dwindling reserves of energy. The constant tension between work, caregiving, and parenting felt like a tightrope walk with no safety net. I often declined promotions at the hospital because I couldn't afford the extra hours away from home or the added stress. It wasn't ambition holding me back. It was survival. Marcus, on the other hand, seemed to glide through life on a cushion of favoritism and my quiet support. Whenever he needed something, a new laptop for school, a car repair, or simply a ride to an interview, I was there. I never made a fuss. His problems felt urgent. Mine were invisible. When family gatherings rolled around, Marcus's successes were celebrated with cheers, while I was expected to quietly support from the sidelines. My husband, Tom, watched all this with a growing concern I couldn't always admit to him. He tried to help where he could, offering to cook dinner after long shifts or take Harper for an afternoon. But even he felt powerless against the weight of my family's expectations. Sometimes, after a particularly draining day, he'd ask gently, "Quinn, when do you get to take care of yourself?" And I'd smile weakly, brushing off the question like it was a luxury I couldn't afford. Despite all of this, I clung to a fragile hope that my sacrifices would someday be recognized, not through grand gestures or apologies, but through simple respect and a place at the family table that wasn't shadowed by cold dismissals. I thought that if I just kept holding us all together, the fractures would mend, and Harper would see a family that loved her unconditionally. But deep down, the cracks were growing wider, and the weight heavier. With every dollar I sent, every doctor's appointment I scheduled, and every quiet sacrifice I made, I was unknowingly building walls between myself and the family who should have been my greatest support. And I feared that these walls might not just keep me out, but could trap Harper in the same cycle I'd struggled to escape. That family gathering started quietly enough. A routine Sunday brunch at my parents' house, one of those rare occasions when most of us managed to be there together. The sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting warm patterns on the polished wooden table where Marcus's kids laughed and passed around plates piled high with pancakes and bacon. From the corner of the room, I watched Harper, nervous but eager to be part of it all. I held her close for a moment, smoothing down the strands of her curly hair, wanting her to feel safe despite the underlying chill I sensed in the air. Harper was always careful, trying hard to fit in, but that day, like so many others before it, she was met with a different standard. At one point, she reached for a glass of orange juice, just as Marcus's youngest accidentally knocked over his cup, splattering sticky liquid across the tablecloth. Marcus barely batted an eye, and my parents exchanged amused glances, their smiles easy and indulgent. It was as if chaos from Marcus's children was expected and forgiven. But when Harper, trying to be helpful, picked up a napkin and accidentally brushed it against the edge of a plate, causing a tiny chip to chip loose. My mother's reaction was immediate and harsh. Elaine's voice cut through the laughter like a sharp knife. "Harper, be careful. You're such a mess. Can't you do anything right? You're always so clumsy." I felt the room's atmosphere shift instantly. Heads turned, and an uncomfortable silence grew as Elaine's words hung heavy in the air. Harper froze, her little hands tightening around the napkin. Eyes wide and shimmering with tears, she tried desperately to blink away. She looked to me for comfort, but even I struggled to find the words to shield her from that coldness. I gently reached for her hand and whispered, "It's okay, sweetheart. Accidents happen." But Elaine wasn't finished. She narrowed her eyes, her voice dropping to a sharper edge. "If you don't learn to behave properly, you'll never get anywhere in this family. You need to stop acting like such a disappointment." My heart clenched, the familiar sting of those words hitting me as if I were the one being scolded. I wanted to say something, to defend Harper, to tell my mother that this cruelty was unnecessary. But before I could, Samuel's voice cut in, steady and authoritative, though lacking any warmth. "That's enough, Quinn. You're too soft on her," he said, shaking his head with thinly veiled disapproval. "She needs to toughen up if she's going to make it in this world." His eyes flicked toward Harper, then back at me, as if to emphasize that his judgment was final. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. "Harper is just a child. She didn't mean to cause any trouble," I said quietly, hoping to diffuse the tension without escalating things. But Samuel dismissed me with a wave of his hand, his gaze hardening. "This isn't about being mean. It's about teaching her the consequences of her actions. She'll learn a lesson." The words echoed painfully in my mind. "She'll learn a lesson," a phrase I'd heard too many times, always carrying the weight of cold discipline, not care. I glanced around the room and noticed the stark difference in how my parents treated Marcus's children. When Marcus's eldest spilled syrup on the floor minutes earlier, Elaine had simply handed him a towel with a smile, saying, "It's okay, honey. We all make mistakes." Samuel had even ruffled the boy's hair and told him he was a strong kid who could handle anything. But Harper? She was the scapegoat, the one singled out for every mistake, no matter how small. The unfairness was glaring and painful, like a wound laid bare in front of everyone. I felt my throat tighten with a mix of frustration and helplessness. I wanted to argue, to expose this hypocrisy, but I feared it would only deepen the rift. Instead, I sank into myself, the humiliation creeping in as relatives exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Harper's lower lip trembled, and she looked up at me with vulnerable eyes that spoke volumes. A silent plea for protection I struggled to fulfill in that moment. I pulled her close, whispering reassurances, but inside I felt a growing doubt. Was this how it was going to be from now on? Public humiliation masked as discipline, while the rest of the family watched silently? The phrase, "she'll learn a lesson," reverberated in my head like a warning bell. It wasn't just about Harper. It was a message to me as well, their way of asserting control, of reminding me that I wasn't enough, that my care and my daughter's innocence were liabilities, not treasures. That day, sitting at the edge of the gathering, holding Harper's trembling hand, I realized this wasn't an isolated moment. It was part of a pattern, a constant, painful reminder of our place in the family hierarchy. I wanted to believe in change, in forgiveness, but the cold truth was settling in deeper than ever before. And as the laughter resumed around us, hollow and strained, I knew that the next steps I took would have to be different. For Harper's sake, and for my own, I had to find a way to break free from this cycle before it broke us completely. The airport buzz was a chaotic symphony of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and distant announcements echoing through the cavernous terminal. Families reunited and said goodbye. Travelers chatted excitedly about their destinations, and children tugged at parents' hands, eager to board. But in the middle of that bustling scene, Harper stood frozen, alone by the gate, clutching her small, worn backpack so tightly her knuckles turned white. My heart pounded in my chest like a frantic drumbeat as I sprinted toward her, my breath ragged, tears stinging the corners of my eyes. Time seemed to slow and compress all at once. Just moments ago, my father, Samuel, the man who should have been Harper's protector, had delivered words so cold and deliberate they froze the air between us. "She'll learn a lesson," he said, his voice void of any warmth as he turned away without looking back. Behind him, my mother, Elaine, stood motionless, her arms crossed, her face unreadable, but her silence was unmistakable consent. She didn't intervene, didn't soften his words or reach out to comfort Harper. Instead, she said quietly, almost as a verdict, "No guilt. She needs a lesson." I remember the fleeting glances from bystanders, some startled, others uncertain whether to step in or look away. A man 2 rows behind me muttered, "That's cold," under his breath, while a woman near the check-in counter cast Harper a worried look that made my throat constrict even more. Yet no one moved, and the boarding call's steady voice carried over the public address system. "Final call for Flight 329 to Orlando. All passengers, please board immediately." Harper's small frame trembled. Her wide eyes searched for me, her mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. She was too stunned, too frightened to understand why her own grandfather was abandoning her here, in the middle of strangers and noise. Her tiny hands gripped the straps of her backpack even tighter, the fabric worn thin from years of use, her silent shield against a world that suddenly seemed far colder than I ever imagined. "Harper!" I called, my voice shaky but urgent, closing the distance in a few hurried strides. "Come here, baby. Let's go." She hesitated, looking toward my parents, hoping perhaps they would change their minds, that the coldness would melt away. But Samuel's back was already turned. Elaine's eyes were fixed somewhere beyond the gate. The cruel finality in their posture was unmistakable. I swallowed the lump forming in my throat and knelt down beside Harper. "It's okay. I'm here," I whispered, pulling her close, feeling her little body shiver against mine. I could smell the faint scent of her shampoo mixed with a hint of sweat and fear. My hands trembled as I brushed her curly hair behind her ear, trying to muster the strength to protect her from the pain they were inflicting. Why are they leaving me?" Harper's voice was barely audible, a cracked whisper that pierced through the noise around us. I wanted to explain, to make sense of their cruelty, but there were no words gentle enough. Instead, I held her tighter, fighting back tears. "They're wrong, sweetheart. They're wrong. I'm not going to let anything happen to you." The crowd was thinning as passengers moved onto the jet bridge. The final boarding call was a harsh countdown. "Last call. Board now or miss your flight." And I could see the plane waiting outside the large windows, its engines humming, ready to take off without Harper. "Mom!" I cried out desperately, my voice cracking as I turned to face them. "You can't do this. You can't just leave her here." Samuel's eyes met mine briefly, cold and unyielding. "She needs to learn boundaries. If you don't let her face consequences, she'll never grow up." Elaine's nod was slow, deliberate. "We've given her chances. This is necessary." I shook my head, disbelief burning in every fiber of my being. "You're abandoning her. This is cruelty, not discipline." But they were unmoved, their faces hardened like stone. The boarding agent gestured urgently toward the jet bridge, signaling final call. Samuel took a step forward, and without another glance, disappeared into the line of passengers boarding the plane. Elaine lingered a moment longer, then turned away, her expression unreadable, leaving Harper and me stranded in the middle of a crowd that felt suddenly hostile and indifferent. I knelt beside Harper again, my heart shattering into pieces I didn't know could exist. Around us, the terminal continued its indifferent hum, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. Harper's small body shook with silent sobs, her face buried in my chest. "Come on, Harper. We're leaving. This isn't over." I stood, clutching her hand tightly, determined to chase down every ounce of hope and fight for her like never before. But as the plane's engines roared to life and the last passengers disappeared inside, I realized that everything had changed in that moment, and the family I thought I knew was unraveling before my eyes. I slid into the driver's seat of my car, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The noise of the airport faded behind me, the rushing footsteps, the final boarding announcements, the hum of engines preparing for takeoff, all drowned beneath the roaring storm inside my chest. I stared out the windshield, but the world beyond blurred into a haze of gray as my mind replayed the moment over and over. Harper, standing alone at the gate, clutching her backpack like it was a lifeline, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. And my parents, cold and unyielding, walking away as if abandoning her was nothing more than a routine lesson. The grief hit me first, a crushing, suffocating weight that settled deep in my bones. How could they do this? How could the people who were supposed to love and protect us treat Harper like she was a problem to be discarded? It wasn't just the abandonment at the airport. It was all the years of neglect and emotional cruelty that had led to this moment. Like a relentless tide, memories surged forward, each one a jagged stone that cut into my heart. I saw myself as a little girl again, desperate for approval that never came. I heard my father's voice, praising Marcus while pretending I was invisible, my achievements minimized or ignored. I felt the sting of my mother's cold critiques, calling me too soft or too sensitive, as if my very nature was a flaw that needed fixing. And beneath it all, the quiet but constant message that I was never quite enough, that no matter how much I sacrificed or tried, I was always on the outside looking in. But it wasn't just my past they were rejecting. It was Harper's future. The little girl who looked at me with such trust, who deserved nothing less than warmth and protection, was being handed over to coldness disguised as discipline. The phrase echoed in my mind, sharp and bitter. She'll learn a lesson. As if cruelty was a lesson. As if abandonment was a way to teach boundaries. No, it was a lie wrapped in harsh words. Anger began to burn through the grief, a fierce flame that refused to be snuffed out. How dare they use Harper's innocence as a pawn in their power games? How could they think that leaving a frightened 8-year-old alone in a crowded terminal was anything but cruel? The image of Harper's trembling hands, clutching that worn backpack, her silent armor against a world that suddenly turned hostile, seared into me. I could still feel the weight of her tiny body pressed against mine, the scent of her hair, the quiet sobs I tried to hold back. I gritted my teeth, fists clenched so tightly my nails dug into my palms. I realized then that beneath all my years of trying to keep the peace, to protect my family despite their pain, I had been enabling a pattern of abuse. I had been hoping for change, for understanding, but all they had ever given me were excuses dressed as lessons, coldness masquerading as discipline. They didn't want to love Harper. They wanted to control her, to punish her for existing. The truth hit me hard and unrelenting. They would never change. My parents weren't capable of the kindness and respect Harper and I deserved. Their cruelty was a shield, a way to maintain power and dominance, to keep me in a place of submission and silence. And now, with Harper's frightened face burned into my memory, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the air thick with tears I refused to shed. There was no room for denial or hope anymore, only the cold clarity of reality. This family had exploited my kindness for too long, and if I didn't draw a line here, it would only get worse. Harper's safety and dignity had to come first. I owed her a life where she was protected, cherished, and never left alone in a sea of strangers. The fog of confusion and despair began to lift, replaced by a fierce resolve. I wouldn't let their cruelty define us. I wouldn't let Harper learn the same painful lessons I did. I would be her shield, her voice, her sanctuary. And if that meant breaking ties, standing up to my parents, and facing whatever fallout came next, I was ready. As the car engine idled softly, I reached into my bag and pulled out a small notebook I always carried, a place where I'd quietly documented years of interactions, notes, and memories that now felt like evidence of a long, hidden battle. Flipping it open, I traced the inked words, each one a testament to the sacrifices I made, the neglect I endured, and the moments I was forced to witness my daughter's innocence being chipped away. I wiped my hands over my face and looked up, the fading daylight casting long shadows across the dashboard. Outside, the world moved on, oblivious to the fracture that had just split my family in two. But inside me, A new chapter was beginning, one not defined by silent suffering, but by fierce protection and unyielding boundaries. I turned the key in the ignition, ready to drive forward into whatever came next. Harper's lesson wouldn't be the one my parents wanted her to learn. It would be a lesson in love, safety, and standing up against cruelty, even when it came from the people who should have loved us the most. The moment I closed the car door behind us, the raw ache of what had just happened settled into a heavy, simmering determination. The grief that had flooded me moments before was now sharpening into something more focused, something I could grasp and wield. I knew instinctively that if I wanted to protect Harper, if I wanted to stop this cycle of neglect and cruelty from swallowing us whole, I'd have to be smarter, more strategic. There was no room for hope alone anymore. I needed a plan. I began by taking stock of what I controlled within this family web, because, despite the dysfunction and emotional chaos, I had quietly built a foundation of responsibility and oversight that could become my leverage. For years, I'd been the one managing the family finances behind the scenes. Most of the bills, medical expenses, home repairs, even some of Marcus's rent checks, flowed through accounts I had access to. My name was on key bank accounts, and I held authority over credit cards used for the grandparents' care. That was a start. Then there was medical care. Grandma and Grandpa's health had deteriorated slowly but steadily, and over time, I'd become their primary medical advocate. I scheduled doctor's appointments, managed medications, and communicated with home health aides and specialists. My parents rarely showed up for these appointments, often citing other commitments, but I was there, taking meticulous notes, making sure nothing was missed. Their care was literally in my hands, and the legal side was something I'd only begun to understand in recent years but had taken seriously. I'd consulted a lawyer once when Marcus had needed help with a complicated housing issue, and another time when Harper's pediatrician suggested we formalize medical consent forms so I could make decisions in emergencies without delay. Through those interactions, I gained insight into what powers I held and what gaps needed filling. I had copies of wills, powers of attorney, and guardianship documents tucked safely away in a drawer at home. That night, as Harper slept beside me, I pulled out my laptop and began creating a detailed inventory. I listed financial assets, bank accounts, property deeds, and insurance policies. I wrote down the names and numbers of doctors, the schedules for medications, and contacts for home care providers. I revisited emails and texts, gathering evidence of neglect, dismissiveness, and outright refusal to help from my parents. Every cold word, every refusal to show empathy, every instance where Harper or I were put last, they were all part of a pattern, and patterns could be documented. I started a new journal, different from the quiet, personal notes I'd kept before. This was a log to track every interaction moving forward: phone calls, texts, meetings, and visits. Each entry detailed who said what, when, and how it made Harper or me feel. I knew that if this family was going to unravel publicly, and I suspected it would, I'd need proof. Not just for my own clarity, but to safeguard Harper's future and myself against gaslighting or false claims. The challenge was huge. I couldn't afford to be obvious. Samuel and Elaine were masters at twisting situations, at painting me as the unreasonable one if I showed weakness. So I resolved to keep my calm exterior, maintaining the facade of the dutiful daughter and caregiver, while quietly tightening my hold where it mattered. I reached out to the lawyer I'd spoken to briefly before, explaining the situation in guarded terms. The lawyer advised me on the steps to protect Harper legally, including filing for guardianship rights if necessary, and how to secure financial control to ensure my parents couldn't exploit resources meant for Harper or the grandparents. I learned about temporary restraining orders in cases of emotional abuse and abandonment, options I hadn't even considered, but that suddenly felt crucial. Late into the night, I sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of paperwork, bills, and medical records. The faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling were the only sounds. I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and clarity. For so long, I had been running on hope and forgiveness. Now, I was running on resolve and facts. I thought about Harper's small face at the airport gate, scared and confused. That image burned into my mind, fueling every decision I made. I promised myself that no one would ever have that power over her again, not without consequences. The family's dependencies, finances, healthcare, legal oversight, they were all vulnerabilities I could use to protect us. As dawn crept through the window, painting the kitchen in pale light, I closed the laptop and leaned back. The path ahead was uncertain and daunting, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had the tools to fight back. I wasn't just a caretaker anymore. I was a strategist, a protector wielding the quiet power I'd built in the shadows. And with that realization, the next move was clear. I would begin to untangle the web that bound us, thread by thread, starting with the very systems that had kept me captive for years. Harper's safety depended on it. The first days after that unbearable scene at the airport were a strange blend of exhaustion and adrenaline. I moved like a ghost through the routines of life, but beneath the surface, I was quietly recalibrating, reshaping the way I existed within this family that had long used me as their invisible support system. I knew I had to start withdrawing, not with a bang, but with a careful, deliberate silence that would throw them off balance without giving them immediate ammunition to turn against me. The moment I decided to pull back, it felt like stepping onto thin ice, fragile, tense, and uncertain. But the truth was, I'd been walking on that ice for years. Now I needed to crack it, slowly and precisely, to free Harper and myself from their grasp. So I began with the finances, the lifeblood of their dependency. For years, I'd been quietly covering bills, sending money to Marcus when he hit rough patches, helping with my grandparents' medical expenses, and patching holes in my parents' struggling construction business. It was a role I never asked for, but one I had accepted out of a mixture of duty and hope that my efforts might one day be recognized. I started by stopping the transfers to Marcus's account. At first, I brushed it off with vague excuses when he asked, "Tight month, you know how it is." I declined his calls a little more often, citing extra shifts or exhaustion. He grumbled, but he didn't have an alternative. I was his financial safety net for so long that he was caught completely off guard. Next, I quietly told the home health agency managing my grandparents' care that moving forward, payments would be handled directly by my lawyer's trust account. That way, I could control disbursement without alerting my parents to the shift immediately. The changes were subtle, almost imperceptible if you weren't paying close attention. To Samuel and Elaine, I remained the dutiful daughter on the surface. I answered their texts, agreed to help when asked. But behind closed doors, I started saying no more often. When Elaine asked if I could pick up groceries or drive Grandma to an appointment, I declined with a soft, "I'm sorry, I'm swamped at work," or "I have Harper's school event I can't miss." I didn't have to explain more. They knew I was stretched thin, but they didn't know I was intentionally limiting their access. Each refusal was a careful test. Would they push? Would they notice? And so far, they stayed silent or accepted my absence with thinly veiled frustration. That silence was telling. My withdrawal was unsettling because it challenged their expectation that I'd always be there, always available, always the one to pick up the mess. The most critical step was updating legal documents. I had arranged a meeting with the lawyer I trusted, one who understood the nuances of family law and the delicate lines between care, control, and abuse. Together, we reviewed wills, powers of attorney, and guardianship papers. I requested to have Samuel and Elaine removed from any medical decision-making rights regarding Harper without my explicit consent. It was a protective measure, safeguarding Harper from any further episodes of neglect or emotional abandonment. This wasn't a move I took lightly. The lawyer warned me about the potential backlash, legal battles, family drama, the emotional fallout. But I knew that Harper's safety outweighed all those risks. I signed the necessary documents, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. The papers felt like both armor and a wedge, a way to protect my daughter and to start carving out boundaries that my parents had never respected. I also changed passwords on shared accounts to prevent unauthorized access, securing Harper's school records, medical files, and insurance information under my sole control. These steps were invisible to most, but significant in the quiet war I was waging. Each locked door, each restricted access was a line in the sand. Yet, despite all these changes, I kept my voice calm and steady when I spoke with my family. I didn't want to trigger immediate confrontation. I wanted my resolve to grow quietly, like a storm gathering strength. When Samuel asked why I hadn't replied to his messages, I said, busy with work and Harper's schedule. When Elaine questioned why I wasn't coming by as often, I replied with a polite, things are hectic right now. No anger, no accusations, just a steady retreat. Inside, my heart ached with every slight I inflicted, knowing that these boundaries might cause pain. But I also knew that the deeper pain came from the years of neglect, and if I didn't set these limits, the cycle would continue unchecked. Harper deserved better. I deserved better. The tension simmered beneath our interactions like a low boil. My family noticed the shift, surely, but they couldn't grasp the full extent of what was happening. They only sensed the change in the rhythms they had taken for granted, the silent refusal to be their fixer, their caretaker, their emotional punching bag. Their reliance on me was now becoming uncomfortable, and from their side, I could already hear the thinly veiled complaints start to whisper behind closed doors. But I stayed firm, quiet, and measured in my resolve. This was only the beginning. The careful withdrawal was a fragile but crucial step toward reclaiming our lives. Harper was watching, and I had to be her steady anchor, the protector who refused to let the past's shadows stretch over her future. The path ahead was uncertain, but I was no longer willing to be a passive participant in a family that demanded my sacrifices without respect or compassion. With every small no, every locked account, every legal document signed, I was quietly breaking the chains that had held us captive for too long. The next moves had to be just as deliberate, just as unyielding, because this wasn't just about enforcing boundaries. It was about taking back our dignity and ensuring Harper's safety in a family where love had too often been conditional and cold. I remember the moment I decided it was time to deliver the blow, the one that would finally draw the line in the sand, separating me and Harper from the cold grip of my parents' cruelty. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. It was the culmination of years of silent suffering, of sacrifices taken for granted, and that unbearable moment at the airport where my father abandoned my little girl like she was a forgotten suitcase. But now, armed with clearer eyes and a resolute heart, I was ready to act. The first step was clear: revoke Samuel and Elaine's access to Harper. I knew exactly what that meant in practice. They could no longer be the gatekeepers to her medical care, her school information, or even her social calendar. No more surprise visits. No more whispered criticisms behind closed doors. No more cold dismissals masquerading as lessons. I contacted Harper's school and pediatrician, submitting legal documentation that designated me as the sole guardian with decision-making authority. The school secretary's voice over the phone was polite, but tinged with surprise when I explained the change. I could hear the faint rustle of papers as she updated records. "We'll make sure no unauthorized person can access Harper's files," she assured me. Relief flooded through me like a quiet tide. Next came the wills and estate plans, a painful but necessary step. I worked closely with my lawyer to remove Samuel and Elaine from anything that granted them rights to Harper's inheritance or any decisions that might affect her future security. I had once believed those documents symbolized family unity, but now they felt like chains, binding Harper to people who had shown they were unworthy of trust. Signing those papers felt heavy, a mix of sorrow and liberation. I felt a strange kind of justice in reclaiming control, a way to protect Harper's future from the same harshness that had shadowed my own childhood. But I knew that private legal moves wouldn't be enough. The wider world needed to understand what had happened, that this wasn't just a family dispute, but a matter of neglect and abandonment. "So," I wrote, late into the night, I poured my heart into a social media post, choosing my words carefully, raw enough to convey the pain, but measured enough to avoid being dismissed as an emotional outburst. I described the airport scene: Harper standing alone at the gate, clutching her worn backpack, her eyes filled with confusion and fear while her grandparents boarded the plane without her. I shared the phrase that haunted me: "She'll learn a lesson." exposing it for the cruel justification it was. I spoke of years of favoritism, neglect, and emotional abuse that had culminated in this moment of profound betrayal. But I also affirmed Harper's innocence and worth, declaring my unwavering commitment to protect her. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Messages of support poured in from friends, colleagues, and even strangers who had witnessed similar family struggles. Some shared their own stories of toxic family dynamics. Others offered resources and advice. The post quickly gained traction, reshaping the narrative around our family from secret pain to public reckoning. I made it clear that Harper would no longer attend family events where she wasn't truly welcome. Invitations ceased, and I withdrew her from any shared family gatherings. The decision was heartbreaking. Watching Harper's face fall when she realized she wouldn't see her grandparents or cousins for the foreseeable future. But it was necessary. Harper deserved a safe space, a place of unconditional love, not a stage for cruelty masquerading as discipline. Financially, I cut off the flow of support that had long propped up Samuel and Elaine. No more last-minute bailouts for bills they ignored or debts they accrued recklessly. I communicated firmly through my lawyer that any further requests for money would be declined unless they met specific conditions of respect and accountability. They had relied far too long on my generosity. Now, it was time they faced the consequences of their choices. The family was stunned. Samuel's voice, once so commanding, faltered in private calls where he pleaded for understanding and threatened legal action. Elaine's cold front cracked, her messages shifting from dismissive to desperate, filled with thinly veiled guilt and veiled threats. Marcus stumbled into the void I left, his dependence on me glaringly apparent as he scrambled to cover expenses and manage daily tasks without my quiet support. I stayed calm throughout, my voice steady when I spoke with them, refusing to be baited into arguments or guilt trips. Every boundary I set was firm, yet measured. I didn't want to punish them. I wanted accountability and respect, things that had been denied to me and Harper for far too long. Throughout it all, I kept Harper close, watching her slowly begin to heal from the wounds inflicted by those who should have cherished her most. Her smile returned in small bursts, her laughter growing freer. Together, we built new routines, new rituals of safety and love. I became not just her mother, but her fierce protector, a role I embraced with a strength I didn't know I had. As the social media post continued to ripple through our community, I realized that this was more than just a family dispute unfolding behind closed doors. It was a reckoning, a call for change not only in my family, but in the way we understand loyalty and love. The doors I closed were not just about exclusion, they were about creating space for healing and respect. The battle ahead was far from over, and the fractures within the Lee family ran deep. But the line had been drawn. I had taken the first decisive step in reclaiming our lives, demanding the respect and dignity Harper deserved. And with that, a new chapter was beginning. One where love wasn't conditional, and protection wasn't negotiable. The moment I cut off the financial lifelines that had long propped up my parents and older brother, the ground beneath our family began to shift in ways that were both subtle and seismic. For years, I'd been the invisible bank, the safety net stretched taut beneath their stumbles, covering bills, medical expenses, and everyday costs without question or gratitude. That quiet flow of support was now a dam I had closed, and the consequences rippled immediately. Samuel and Elaine, once so sure of their control, suddenly found themselves staring at unpaid bills stacking up faster than they could manage. The lights flickered ominously in my parents' home one evening. A late notice from the utility company left unopened on the kitchen counter like a ticking time bomb. Phone calls from creditors went unanswered, their usual bluster no longer enough to keep things afloat. I heard from a neighbor that Samuel's truck, vital for his construction business, had been repossessed after missed payments. The facade of stability I'd been silently propping was cracking, exposing the chaos beneath. Socially, the fallout cut deeper than any financial strain. My parents had long relied on their standing in the community and church groups, places where they basked in respect and influence. But whispers started, hushed conversations behind closed doors, glances thrown over shoulders when they entered rooms. Invitations to gatherings grew scarce. The same circles that had once been welcoming turned cold. their smiles tight and forced. Friends and acquaintances, once loyal, began to distance themselves, unsure how to reconcile the stories swirling around the Lee family now that I'd made our private pain public. Elaine, who had always worn her stoic pragmatism like armor, now found that armor dented and vulnerable. The tight control she wielded over the family's image was slipping through her fingers. At a neighborhood book club she'd frequented for years, she was met with awkward silences and pointed questions veiled as casual concern. Samuel's tall, commanding presence, once enough to silence dissent, was met with uncomfortable looks, and a few pointed remarks whispered just loud enough for him to hear. Their reputation, carefully constructed over decades, was unraveling in ways they hadn't anticipated. Desperate to regain control, Samuel and Elaine launched a barrage of frantic calls and messages. Their voices, once firm and unyielding, now cracked with desperation. Samuel left a voicemail that still haunts me, his tone pleading, almost unrecognizable. "Quinn, please, we can fix this. We're family. Don't cut us out." Elaine's texts alternated between icy dismissals and thinly veiled guilt trips. "You're being unreasonable. This will only hurt Harper." But I had grown too tired of their manipulations to respond with anything but measured silence. Marcus, caught in the crossfire, was the first to crumble. Without my financial backing, his world tilted dangerously. I received panicked messages about rent overdue notices and car troubles. His usual bravado faded, replaced by a raw vulnerability as he admitted, "I don't know how to do this without you, Quinn." The golden child, favored and shielded for so long, had been quietly leaning on me support like a crutch. It was a painful revelation, but also a necessary one. For years I'd carried his burdens alongside my own, often at the cost of my own stability. Meanwhile, relatives who had long turned a blind eye to the family's dysfunction began to ask questions. The stories I had documented, the cold silences, the dismissive tones, the abandonment at the airport, found their way into conversations and social settings. Some family members expressed quiet shock, others disappointment, but most of all, a dawning awareness that the Lee family's polished exterior was a fragile mask hiding years of neglect and pain. Despite the tension spiraling around us, I stayed composed. I refused to be drawn into their guilt trips or angry confrontations. Each time Samuel tried to pull me into a blame game, I listened with a calm voice and repeated my boundaries firmly. Respect and accountability were non-negotiable. I was no longer the family's emotional punching bag or wallet. Harper and I deserved better. The isolation my parents felt was, in part, a consequence of their own choices. They had burned bridges by prioritizing control over connection, cruelty over compassion. Their world was shrinking, and I could see the frustration and helplessness flicker in their eyes when they realized how much they had taken for granted. Through it all, I held Harper close. Watching her slowly reclaim a sense of safety in our small world was the light in the midst of chaos. Her smiles returned in small, precious bursts, her laughter ringing through our home like a rebellion against the silence that once threatened to swallow her whole. The support pouring in from friends, colleagues, and even strangers reminded me we weren't alone, that there was strength in truth and courage in standing up for what's right. Still, I knew the battle was far from over. The tension simmered under the surface, and cracks in the family's facade were deepening. But for the first time, I felt the scales tipping. We were no longer prisoners of their cold lessons. We were carving a new path, one defined by love, respect, and a fierce determination to protect what truly mattered. And with that, the next chapter of our story was just beginning. The days that followed my quiet withdrawal from the family's financial support felt like watching a slow-motion collapse, one I was both horrified by and strangely detached from. Samuel and Elaine, who had long wielded their authority like a shield, suddenly found themselves vulnerable, stripped of the safety net I'd silently woven beneath them for years. The unpaid bills began to pile up, like a dark cloud hanging over their once orderly home. I heard about the flickering lights and the water that hadn't been paid for, stories relayed by neighbors who usually kept their distance. The once pristine garden was left unkempt, the mailbox stuffed with unopened notices, and the hum of normal life started to falter. Samuel's truck, His pride and the backbone of his construction business was repossessed after a series of missed payments. Without that vehicle, his ability to secure and complete jobs vanished, and the business that had been a cornerstone of their identity began to crumble. It was a brutal sight, the physical manifestations of neglect and consequence. In social circles, the reverberations were just as real and painful. The Lee name, once spoken with a mix of respect and quiet admiration in our small community and church groups, was now met with hesitant glances and whispered speculation. Invitations to gatherings dwindled, and the warmth that had always cloaked their presence thinned to a brittle veneer. Elaine, who had perfected the art of maintaining a composed, pragmatic face, found herself on the receiving end of awkward silences and pointed questions about the sudden shifts in their fortunes. Samuel, usually unshakable, felt the sting of subtle rebukes from people who once deferred to his authority. Their carefully constructed facade was cracking, and I could see it in every strained smile and forced laugh during fleeting phone calls. The control they had so desperately clung to was slipping through their fingers like grains of sand. I was prepared for this fallout, had expected it even, but I hadn't counted on the intensity with which they would try to claw back their lost ground. Samuel's voice rang out from my voicemail, desperate and pleading, a stark contrast to the cold man who had abandoned Harper at the airport. "Quinn, please, we can fix this. We're family. Don't shut the door on us," he begged, the vulnerability in his tone almost unrecognizable. Elaine's texts were a confusing mix of icy reprimands and guilt-ridden justifications. "You're being too harsh. This will only hurt Harper. Think about what you're doing." But I had grown too weary of their manipulations to offer anything but silence. Marcus, caught in the crossfire, was the first to visibly crumble. The steady financial support I'd provided, rent money, car repairs, groceries, was suddenly gone. His usual bravado faltered as he admitted in a rare moment of candor, "I don't know how to keep up without you, Quinn." The golden child, once untouchable and favored, was revealed to be just as dependent on me as the rest of them had been. It was painful to witness, but also necessary. For years I'd carried his burdens silently, but now the weight had shifted, forcing him to face realities he'd long avoided. Meanwhile, some relatives who had been distant, willing to turn a blind eye to the family's dysfunction, began to ask questions. The stories I'd meticulously documented, each cold glance, every dismissive word, the abandonment at the airport, started to appear in hushed conversations and worried whispers. Some expressed shock and sadness. Others wrestled with complicated loyalties. But most of all, there was a growing awareness that the polished Lee family image was a fragile mask hiding years of pain and neglect. Through this storm, I maintained my composure. Each time Samuel tried to pull me into a blame game or guilt trip, I responded with calm firmness. "Respect and accountability are non-negotiable," I told him once during a tense phone call. "Harper and I deserve better." I refused to be baited into anger or defensiveness. This was no longer about placating them. It was about protecting what was mine. The isolation my parents experienced was, in many ways, a consequence of their own choices. Their prioritization of control over connection, cruelty over compassion, had burned bridges that were impossible to rebuild overnight. I could sense the frustration flicker in their eyes when they realized how much they had taken for granted and how much they had lost. Meanwhile, Harper was slowly reclaiming her sense of safety. The small smiles that returned to her face, tentative at first, were victories I cherished. Her laughter began to ring through our home again, bright and defiant against the silence that once threatened to swallow her whole. The outpouring of support from friends, colleagues, and even strangers who had witnessed similar family struggles reminded me we were not alone. Together, we were building a new foundation, one grounded in truth, love, and protection. Yet I knew this was far from over. The tension simmered beneath the surface, cracks in the family's facade growing deeper with every interaction, every unanswered call, every cold shoulder. But for the first time in a long time, the scales were tipping. The tide was turning. We were no longer prisoners of their cold lessons. We were carving out a new path, one defined by respect, fierce love, and unyielding boundaries. And with this fragile but growing strength, the next chapter was beginning. Open, uncertain, but ours to write. The moment I drew that line in the sand, declaring that respectful, accountable contact was the only kind I would accept, or else permanent distance, I felt a mixture of relief and dread washing through me. It was as though a weight I hadn't fully acknowledged was suddenly lifted, and yet what lay beyond was an uncertain expanse, a new frontier where everything I'd known was being rewritten. But I knew this was necessary. It was the only way to protect Harper's heart, and my own. The boundaries I set weren't vague or negotiable. I communicated clearly, calmly, and firmly. To Samuel and Elaine, I said, "If you want to be part of Harper's life, you will treat her with respect and care, and you will respect my role as her mother. Anything less, and you will not see her." I wasn't threatening. I was stating a truth I'd lived by now, a truth I could no longer ignore. Their silence in response was a quiet admission that they understood the new terms, even if they loathed them. Some days, the cold distance felt like a chasm too wide to cross. Other days, I sensed a flicker of tentative willingness, but the power to rebuild, if any, would come on my terms. With Harper, everything shifted. Our home became a sanctuary where laughter could bloom again, away from the judgmental eyes and biting words. I made a point of small rituals: Saturday morning pancakes, bedtime stories filled with wonder, and long, slow walks where she could ask questions and dream without fear. I watched her shed layers of hurt and confusion, replaced slowly by a growing confidence that she was worthy of love, not punishment. Her smile returned in pieces, tentative but genuine, lighting up corners of my heart I thought had been dulled forever. Tom, my husband and partner in this new chapter, was an unwavering pillar. His quiet support, whether in warm embraces after a hard day or in practical help with Harper's school projects, reminded me I wasn't alone. When doubt crept in, he was there with steady words, "You're doing what's right," for all of us. Together, we created a rhythm that balanced the demands of life and healing. Our home, once shadowed by family strife, grew into a place of safety and joy. The aftermath rippled through the family, some parts fracturing while others began to reconsider their own roles. Marcus, stripped of his crutches, faced realities he had long avoided. A few cousins and distant relatives reached out cautiously, expressing remorse or seeking understanding. Yet others withdrew, retreating into silence or denial, unwilling to confront what had been revealed. The Lee family's old dynamics were cracking, exposing raw edges that couldn't easily be smoothed over. But I wasn't afraid of the cracks anymore. I'd come to see them as openings, opportunities for truth and change. I learned that respect is not given freely in families like mine. It must be demanded, and sometimes fought for, with patience and resolve. Boundaries became the invisible armor that shielded Harper and me from the toxic cycles we'd endured. They weren't walls built to isolate, but fences crafted to protect the fragile garden of love we were growing. I realized that blood ties mean nothing if they come at the price of dignity and safety. Every day was still a balancing act. I juggled work, motherhood, and the emotional fallout with a careful grace I hadn't known I possessed. But with each passing moment, I felt more grounded, more certain that I was no longer defined by past suffering, but by the fierce love and protection I offered Harper. We were no longer victims of a cold lesson. We were authors of a new story, one where kindness was the true legacy. The road ahead remained uncertain. There would be challenges, old wounds reopened, and moments of doubt. But I embraced that uncertainty as part of the journey, knowing that the greatest lesson I could teach Harper was this: that she deserved respect, love, and safety, that sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that pave the way for healing and freedom. And as I watch Harper grow, radiant and resilient, I know we've begun something powerful, a life where boundaries protect love, respect is earned, and family is redefined not by blood alone, but by the kindness we choose to give and receive.